Hello! Thank you so much for dropping by this video. A warm welcome to anyone who's new to this channel, and a hello to my regulars. So I felt inspired to make a video answering the question, who was Ramana Maharshi? I had a few people by my house last night who hadn't heard him and saw a picture of him and wanted to know. So this video is inspired by them, and this video is dedicated to this beautiful soul who's had a deep part in my spiritual journey for a long time now. So, and first and foremost, Ramana was born late, and historical facts and dates aren't my forte, so I'm going to have to approximate some of those. He was born late in the late 1800s, a small Hindu village, a small Hindu family. Nothing particularly unusual about him as a child, except when he was picked for sports, whatever team he was on would always win. Not necessarily because of his athleticism, but so he would always get picked. And also when he would sleep, it was very hard to wake him up. His relatives would be shaking him and yelling at him, and he just wouldn't wake up. Other than that, Ramana was a normal kid. No particular religious or spiritual orientation, anything out of the ordinary for a Hindu family. And then he heard that one of his relatives had died, and it was quite a shock to him. My memory is that he had heard about death, but he didn't really fully get the idea. And so he was just overcome with this intense fear, but he was also overcome with this intense desire to know the truth about death. So he went into his bedroom, and at this age, I think it was 11, 12, maybe 13. I think it was 13 actually. And he took a deep breath, and he laid on his floor like a corpse and didn't move, and just imagined what it would be like to die. And he imagined, okay, the body gets stiff. Okay, I lose awareness of the world. Okay, eventually even this mind stops. And then he became aware of something, and he used different words to describe it. Sometimes he would call it the self. Sometimes he would call it consciousness. Sometimes he would call it God. When reflecting on this time, he said a current. He became aware of this current that was beyond death, that could not die, that he was this current or this consciousness, and that he could not die. And then he came back to awareness of his body, because he totally lost awareness of his body and the world. And he came back to awareness of that. And he was completely changed. Within 2 weeks, he left home to become, in India, what's called a mendicant or a sadhu, a wandering spiritual person who has no possessions. And with no real training, and just immersed in this deep state of samadhi, union with God, and he traveled to a sacred mountain in India that he had heard of, and actually before his awakening, he had felt a draw to. And he traveled this mountain, and when he got there, he went into a temple and just went into samadhi. He lost awareness of the world. Rats were chewing on him. Ants were crawling all over him, eating him. Other people couldn't be in the room for 10 minutes, but he was so not aware of this world, it didn't bother him. And and he's 13 years old ish. I don't know the exact date. And from that very unique, interesting beginning, he became considered one of India's greatest saints or teachers or gurus, depending how you view him. And there's many, 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 many more things I could say about him. But let's see, we have a question here. Someone wrote, is the self real? According to non-duality, the self is an illusion and everything is one consciousness experiencing itself. So free will doesn't exist and everything is an illusion happening by itself. Well, so it just depends what you mean by the self. Do you mean your personality? Or do you mean, right, when Ramana talked about the self, he was talking about with a capital S. He's talking about cosmic consciousness, the consciousness of God. So I believe from your question, you're asking, is the S with a little, the small s, real, like the personality? And before we even go to this question, non-duality it's a very exact, precise thing. And it's been an exploration in India for something like 3,000-4,000 years before written history. And so this question highlights the thing that non-duality is not a casual thing. Because there are teachers out there who use imprecise language and really confuse people and actually harm people. So I just want to, I'm not trying to make the person who asked this question wrong, but just highlighting. So your question says, is the self real? According to non-duality, the self is an illusion. I'm not trying to play word games, but I'm simply asking, what do you mean by the self? Because non-duality normally talks about the self only with a capital S. And they talk about our personality as there's different words, like they'll call it mind, or they'll call it, in very precise terms, they'll call it the subtle body, or the personality, or the person. So, yeah. So a big part of my journey with non-duality, as people who've been on this channel know, is critiquing and highlighting issues just like what I just highlighted. That modern non-duality is really not really what Ramana taught, and not what the people before Ramana taught or experienced. And tonight I want to put all that aside, and I just want to talk about Ramana from my heart, because I had a dream last night with Ramana, and it was so touching. And Ramana Maharshi was a love bug. Was and is. I think some way, somehow, Ramana still exists. And all you need to do is look at a picture of him, and you'll know what I mean. I was once looking at a picture of Ramana, and I just had such a clear sense that all Ramana was about is love. And everything else is just a skillful means for him to share that love and draw people into that love. Of course, I'm not talking about human love, but a love beyond words, and a love that's bigger than everything, that maybe underlies everything. He was quite the comedian. He would make jokes. Sometimes he would make jokes and combine them with teaching. He would read the Indian epics, sort of I don't want to say mythology, but what maybe an outsider might call the Hindu mythology. And he would enact the different characters, taking on their voice and changing his physical mannerisms. And speaking of mendicants, which he was a sadhu, some mendicants came to visit the ashram once. And, sadhus and mendicants don't always have the best reputation for a variety of reasons, which I won't get into now. And so some of the people around Ramana who kind of ran the ashram, put up a sign that said mendicants are not welcome here. And so Ramana left the ashram. He said, and when they came and found him, he's like, well, I'm a mendicant. And at one time when his health was not well, the devotees were always doing things without asking him. Like they're trying to protect him. I mean, to be a guru, it's not an easy thing. I mean, I'm not a guru, but we have this idea of like, oh, being a guru, like it'd be so great. But if you're a guru, you have to deal with your devotees, and they're not always so helpful. So one time when Ramana's physical health wasn't so well, the devotees wanted to give him a chance to rest. So they put up a sign like, please don't enter every day Ramana would go and sit in the hall and greet people. But, and the devotees were trying to take care of his health. So they put up a sign that said, between the hours of 2 to 5, please don't enter the hall. And when Ramana found out about this, he just went and sat outside. He didn't ask the devotees to take the sign down. So that's cheating a little bit because I'm basically sharing stories about Ramana. First, I shared the history, then I addressed a philosophical issue, and now I just shared some anecdotes. So enough of that. Now I'm going to share from my heart. That's the problem with non-duality, is it's very easy to get up in your head with it. Ramana Maharshi was, humanity at its best. Utter gentleness, utter kindness, the desire to be helpful, sensitivity. He met each person who approached him, he met them where they were at. Some people he wouldn't say a word, he would just emanate. Some people he would just talk about business, talk about life. Some people intense philosophical conversations. I first heard about Ramana in 1996 when I saw a book and a picture of him. And, it's on the back cover of the book, it said that he taught a form of meditation of inquiry, who am I? And I just looked at the picture and I'm like, wow, that dude looks peaceful. In fact, it was this very picture. The most famous picture of him. God, look at those eyes. Look at those eyes. I mean, I think this is just a copy of a picture. And look at those eyes. And I just asked myself, who am I? I didn't know what it meant. Didn't know what I was doing. And then I found out a little bit more about him a couple of years later and kind of became obsessed. I have a love-hate relationship with Ramana Maharshi. Now it's mostly love, but for years it was a love-hate. I loved how peaceful I felt. There was a temple near my town that was devoted to him, and I loved how peaceful I felt there. And I loved the idea that it was possible to be at permanent peace. I just hated so many other things. Like Ramana didn't take care of his body. He totally ignored his body. And, this idea that the world is an illusion, which isn't exactly what he taught and what non-duality taught. It's not exactly. And there were other, philosophical. It was more philosophical that I just was so angry at him sometime and angry at non-duality. But, the more I learned, the more I realized that what was being taught in his name was, it's become a religion. There's no two ways about it. And very disconnected, very extremely disconnected, ridiculously disconnected. He's rolling in his grave. It's so disconnected from what he taught. And that was helpful to learn that. And then I realized I wanted to be just like him, except I wanted to be a dancing Ramana. I love to dance and into yoga, and I was into Neo-Tantra, still am a little bit. Wow. Yoshi wrote, his eyes are so radiant, and Yoshi wrote, and I don't mention it's okay that you did, Yoshi, but I don't mention names of other teachers anymore. But Yoshi wrote, blank, a very famous Neo-Advaita teacher, has turned his teachings into a cult of emotions. True that. John wrote, I love watching and listening to your videos. I'm so glad they're helpful because, this channel started out as an expose of one particular Neo-Advaita guru, neo-non-duality guru. Then it became an expose of neo-non-duality in general. And now for me, it's something I just have to do. I'm tempted to say it's therapy, but it's not really. It's some combination, I hope, of therapy and service, because Neo-Advaita is very dangerous. I speak from experience. And Ramana was the opposite of Neo-Advaita. He was all heart and all spontaneity. He was very human, not into rituals, not into formulas. But back to my journey with Ramana. And he really is, beyond the mind. It's so tragically ironic how mental non-duality has become. I would add, has turned Ramana's teachings into a cult of emotions and word games. And I played those word games with myself for a long time. Luckily, I didn't pass them on to too many other people. But I'm looking at a picture of Ramana right now. And, what can you say? What can you say about wholeness? Wholeness is wholeness. You can't really argue with it. I mean, you can. But in the experience of it, it's whole and complete. And as I've shared before, where I am and my journey is called samadhi with effort, where the sense of individuality melts with effort and comes back. So it's not effortless samadhi, the end goal, the end game. That's pretty good. Wholeness is pretty good. Fullness is pretty good. And so for those of us who've been to 1,000 Neo-Advaita satsangs and still don't have effortless samadhi, what to do? Well, I'm finally practicing what I preached, which is, Ramana, the only complete treatise that Ramana wrote, the Upadesha Saram, starts at karma yoga. And then moves on to bhakti yoga. And then after that, Raja yoga. But I don't feel ready for Raja yoga yet. So yeah, I've kind of put aside everything I've learned, put aside self-inquiry, and just went back to karma yoga and bhakti yoga. And so Ramana was a living example that death of the ego isn't death of the personality. I mean, he went through a very extreme kind of death of personality when he was in that samadhi and letting the rats chew on him. But once he emerged, he was quite human. And I've shared a couple examples. And that really gets lost in the word games, and that really gets lost in this I'll just leave it at that. That paradoxically you become more of yourself, your best self. And by self right now, I should say, the expression you become more of yourself, that's confusing in non-duality, but Ramana shows that, Ramana's life demonstrates that you become your best lowercase s self. There's all this talk of destroying the ego and destroying the person or destroying the personality. But actually, Ramana, classical Vedanta, and Ramana said so. I don't know, I can't remember a quote of Ramana saying this, but the problem isn't the personality, it's identification with the personality. In fact, Ramana did say that. He said, what does it matter whether thoughts keep coming? It's whether you identify with them. I'm paraphrasing there. But Ramana is a living proof that the personality doesn't die, it just gets radically transformed. And one of the most radical transformations is that the personality no longer contains the thought, I am this personality. What's a personality without the thought, this is me? It's just kind of like a costume. In yogic terms, they call it the subtle body, the configuration of emotions and lower mind and, all the things we call personality. The yogis just called it the subtle body, and the subtle body doesn't get destroyed. It's absurd. If the subtle body was destroyed, you couldn't eat. You couldn't do anything without a subtle body. Or said in non-dual terms, nothing could be done through you. So if that's your goal, that okay, like, but just know what you're signing up for. Like, you're gonna die. You're gonna die of starvation, but you won't care because you'll be, totally blissed out. But Ramana Maharshi died the day Gandhi was killed, or he wept. And you know what? He didn't weep when he found out the news. He wept when on the national radio station they played Gandhi's favorite bhajan, Gandhi's favorite religious devotional song. That touched Ramana so deeply that he wept. So the thing is, now that I believe, there's always room for fine tuning, but there's some live YouTube. Now that I finally have an accurate understanding of Ramana's teaching, now I'm just in awe of the person that he was. The embodiment of love and peace. But not just the embodiment of love and peace, but just the fucking character. He was such a character. He hung out with animals. Animals were drawn to him. You can see pictures of squirrels sleeping on him. Can you imagine a squirrel sleeping on a person? He would joke around talking about his awakening. He used to shake, when he walked. And when asked about it, he would say his awakening was like shoving an elephant in a tiny shed. Meaning all this power and energy had been put into his body. So now that I've kind of let go of the teachings, or that I'm focusing on the very basics, I'm very excited to get to know Ramana more. And I wish all of that for all of you. The philosophical mind games have a place maybe in the final stages, but without the preparatory practices, they're actually going to take you further away. And that was my experience, that without the solid foundation, all the philosophy and the non-dual word games actually become a barrier. That's why Ramana didn't give speeches, and that's why he taught individuals, because he could tell where each person was at and what they needed. And to boot, non-duality taught wrongly will destroy your life. Like, it's not something to take casually. When all else fails, you can just look at a picture of Ramana or just think of him. He said that the contact doesn't have to be physical, it can be psychic. So thank you, everyone, for joining in. And I wish everyone a beautiful evening. And in terms of free will, what Ramana said, he said, whether there's free will or not free will, what did he say? I'm going to get one of my favorite Ramana quotes. Now keep in mind that he would say different things to different people. This was about the reality of the world. He said, God is the same for those who say the world is real and their opponents. Their outlooks are different. You need not enmesh yourself in such disputations. The goal is one to the same. Look to it. In terms of free will or destiny, he said, there are only two ways in which to conquer destiny or be independent of it. One is to inquire who undergoes the destiny and discover the self is not bound by it. The other way is to completely to surrender to the Lord by realizing one's helplessness. He said, free will is implied in the spiritual injunctions to be good. It implies overcoming fate. It is done by wisdom. Wisdom is acquired by association with the wise. But then he would also sometimes say that everything is destined. So it's not my place to instruct anyone. Take care. Much love.